Hi, it's Nicole. Did Shakespeare write his plays? Yes, he did. But do you know that Shakespeare didn't make up a lot of the stories in his plays? He didn't make up the tragic story of Romeo and Juliet, for example. He borrowed it. It was originally written by someone else. I was so shocked when I learned about this for the first time, and I only learned about this about 12 months ago. I was using the Oxford School Shakespeare edition, and one day I suddenly noticed some pages in it titled The Source. It says, for the source of his play, Shakespeare relies almost entirely on a narrative poem, The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet by Arthur Brooke, which was published in 1562 and is itself a translation of a popular prose fiction by Bandello, published 1554, which in turn derives from even earlier Italian stories. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet relies almost entirely on Brooke's work, which was published about 30 years before Romeo and Juliet was written. Shakespeare didn't even change the names of the main characters. Another example is The Tempest. There isn't one source story that The Tempest is based on, but there are many influences from many places. The storm and the shipwreck that start off the play are based on a historical event where one of the fleet of 9 ships sailing for Virginia was separated by a sudden storm, and the crew was stranded on Bermuda. 2 of Montaigne's essays, Of the Cannibals and Of Cruelty, find their way into Gonzalo's and Prospero's speeches. When Prospero resigns his magic, he makes reference to Medea's speech in Ovid's Metamorphoses. The third and last example is Macbeth. The main source for Macbeth was the Chronicles of Scotland, compiled by Raphael Holinshed in 1577. Again, there is a 30-year gap between the source and Shakespeare's play. The Chronicles provide a complete outline of Macbeth's career, from his first meeting with the witches until his death at the hands of Macduff. Holinshed also recounts the killing of an earlier Scottish king, King Duff, who, like King Duncan in Shakespeare's play, was murdered when he was the guest of a trusted subject. I'll read you some extracts from the Chronicles. It fortuned as Macbeth and Banquo journeyed towards Forres, there met them 3 women in strange and wild apparel. The first of them spake and said, O hail Macbeth, Thane of Glamis, for he had lately entered into that dignity and office by the death of his father Sino. The second of them said, O hail Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor, but the third said, O hail Macbeth, that hereafter shall be King of Scotland. Then Banquo, what matter of women, said he, are you, that seems so little favourable unto me, whereas to my fellow here, besides high offices, yet assign also the kingdom, appointing further nothing for me at all. Yes, says the first of them, we promise greater benefits unto thee than unto him, for he shall reign indeed, but with an unlucky end. Neither shall he leave any issue behind him to succeed in his place. Where contrarily, thou indeed shalt not reign at all, but of thee those shall be born, which shall govern the Scottish kingdom by long order of continual descent. I'll stop there, you got the idea. This is from the Chronicles. It sounds like a summary of Macbeth itself, doesn't it? For the history plays, I was vaguely aware they must have been based on some sort of historical account. But the tragedies and comedies as well? What Shakespeare did was more like maybe what we'd call retelling of existing stories, or making prose for reading into verse for the stage, or adapting a novel into a film. I never knew this until I did, and that was about a year ago. And I was really surprised that Shakespeare didn't make those iconic characters up. He didn't create them. How am I supposed to feel about this? Did he credit the original authors, especially since they were written not that long ago? 30 years is nothing. They were his contemporaries. Or maybe those stories were well known enough that he didn't need to and the audience would know. Was Shakespeare plagiarizing? I read you what's written in the sources sections. So far, that's just a fact. Shakespeare's plays rely heavily or less heavily on existing stories at the time. Histories, newspaper reports, essays, and narrative poems. No one explained what the heck is going on. The editors take it for granted that Shakespeare took those stories as sources and made them his own. Again, how am I supposed to feel about this? Should I thank him less because he didn't do what I thought he did, which is to create stories and characters from scratch? But after thinking about it for a few seconds, I realized that he must have done some magic to the original stories, because we all know Romeo and Juliet or Macbeth by Shakespeare. How many of us know the authors of the source stories? If you watched my previous videos, you'd know that I read The Genius of Shakespeare by Jonathan Bate recently. He was the first person who explained this situation to me. I quote, "Our modern conception of genius makes creativity synonymous with originality. In matters artistic, there's no more severe accusation than that of plagiarism. But to the Elizabethans, this procedure would have been admirable, not reprehensible. For them, there was no higher mark of artistic excellence than what they called the lively turning of familiar material. This was the art of copiousness which they were taught in school. Take a piece of received wisdom, a proverb, a phrase, a historical incident, a story out of ancient myth, turn it on the anvil of your inventiveness, and you will give it new life." Thanks so much for explaining it to me. The book then talks a lot about how Shakespeare did it, what makes the characters in his plays stay fascinating and fresh for centuries. I said earlier that Shakespeare didn't create all those iconic characters, but in a sense he did. It was only because of his genius those characters became iconic, which is not the topic of this video. I read this little book recently, Still Like an Artist by Austin Kleon. I read it mainly to find out if Austin Kleon used Shakespeare as an example. He didn't. But on one of the first pages, there is a quote from T.S. Eliot. "Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal. Bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different. The good poet who welds his theft into a whole of feeling, which is unique, utterly different from that from which it was torn." I think that describes the art of Shakespeare perfectly. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one.